The night was thick with silence, the kind that weighed heavy, pressing against the walls of St. Hallow's Hollow like an unseen force. Somewhere in the distance, a lone owl cried, a sound too sharp, too knowing, and then, a whisper, soft, almost hesitant, yet laced with something that made the air grow colder. It wasn't supposed to be like this. The words drifted into the dark, swallowed by the creeping mist, leaving behind only a single undeniable truth. Someone had just seen something they were never meant to see, and now the hunt had begun. The village of St. Marlow lay beneath a restless sky, its silence fractured by the distant echo of unfamiliar voices. The circus had arrived, not with the jubilant fanfare one might expect, but with a slow creeping inevitability, like an ill-omened tide washing ashore. Its presence unsettled the well-rehearsed rhythm of village life, as though a foreign element had been introduced into a perfectly balanced equation. The cobblestone streets, usually so still after nightfall, now held shadows that moved with purpose, figures weaving between gas-lit alleyways, their whispers snatched away by the wind before they could be deciphered. Eleanor Whitmore, seated with calculated stillness by her parlor window, observed the scene with the patience of a hunter waiting for a telltale rustle in the underbrush. The lace curtain barely shifted as she lifted it with delicate fingers, her gaze sweeping over the square below. She was no stranger to the language of unease, the silent exchanges, the nervous glances that carried meaning only to those who knew where to look. And tonight, St. Marlow whispered. The circus had brought with it something far heavier than mere spectacle, an unseen weight pressing against the fabric of the ordinary, threatening to tear it apart at the seams. Near the wagons, two men stood close, too close, their voices low but urgent. One of them, taller, wiry, with a scar running from jaw to temple, held something small and metallic between his fingers. A flicker of light caught it before it disappeared into his sleeve. Eleanor's sharp eyes followed the motion, registering it with quiet certainty. A weapon, a key, a coin exchanged for silence. A few feet away, a woman in a dark cloak hovered at the edge of the square, her gloved hands clenched into fists. She was waiting, hesitating. Something in her posture suggested the agony of indecision, as though she stood on the precipice of a choice she was unwilling to make. Eleanor had seen such moments before, the fraction of a second before a person either fled or stepped irrevocably forward into the unknown. Beyond them, the grand tent loomed, a monstrous silhouette against the moonless sky, its crimson and gold stripes faded by time and travel. The canvas rippled, not just with the restless wind, but with the breath of something unseen, something coiled tight beneath the surface. Within, the glow of lanterns sent flickering shadows careening across the ring, elongated specters that twisted and stretched across the sawdust-covered floor. The villagers, ever creatures of routine, sat on the wooden benches with wide, uncertain eyes, their fingers gripping the edges of their seats as though they might steady themselves against the impossible. The ringmaster emerged from the gloom, his crimson tailcoat gleaming under the wavering gaslights. He moved with the confidence of a man accustomed to bending an audience's will, his gloved hands sweeping the air as he commanded their attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he intoned, his voice slipping through the murmurs like a blade through silk, "tonight we defy the limits of the known world." A pause perfectly timed, the hush absolute. Then, with a dramatic bow, he stepped back, and the spectacle began. High above, the trapeze artist ascended, her form a shimmering vision in silver and midnight blue. She swung gracefully, her limbs extending in perfect arcs, the light catching on the delicate sequins that adorned her costume. The crowd gasped as she released the bar mid-swing, twisting through the air, a fragile moment of weightlessness before her partner's hands found hers in the nick of time. Applause erupted, but Eleanor was not watching the performance. Her gaze was elsewhere, slipping beyond the golden glow of the ring to the edges of the tent, where the real story was unfolding. There in the shadows, stood Raphael Dupont, the knife-thrower. His coat was frayed at the edges, his boots scuffed from long miles traveled, but his His eyes were sharper than any blade he wielded. He stood apart from the others, his arms crossed, his jaw locked tight, his focus fixed not on the performance but on something unseen. A few yards away, another man stood cloaked in darkness, his features obscured by the brim of a weathered hat. Eleanor saw the way Raphael's fingers twitched toward the inside of his coat, an instinctive motion, a muscle memory response of a man who had once drawn steel in a moment of urgency. And then, as the trapeze artist landed to another wave of thunderous applause, the cloaked man turned and slipped into the night. Eleanor let the curtain fall back into place, her fingers already reaching for the small notebook resting on the desk beside her. She did not write just yet, only tapped her pencil lightly against the worn leather cover, her mind sorting through the fragments of the evening: a quiet village, a traveling circus, a knife thrower watching something or someone too intently, a hesitation in the square that spoke of a choice not yet made. Secrets had arrived in St. Malo, creeping in with the wagons, whispering between the ropes of the grand tent, and secrets, Eleanor knew, had a way of turning into something altogether more dangerous. Circus Nocturne had always carried an air of the uncanny, but tonight something was different, something wrong threaded through the very atmosphere like an invisible wire pulled taut, ready to snap. Madame Claudine, the fortune-teller, stood near the entrance, her dark eyes gleaming with a knowing smile, but there was something about the way her fingers tapped against the folds of her shawl that suggested anticipation, as though she had glimpsed a future too ominous to reveal. Just beyond her, the burly strongman leaned whispering something low to one of the painted clowns, who nodded once before slipping into the night, swallowed whole by the darkness between the wagons. The air, thick with the scent of damp earth, sawdust, and burning oil, pulsed with an unspoken tension, as though the entire circus were holding its breath. Then it happened. A shriek, sharp, raw, utterly out of place amid the carefully orchestrated chaos, sliced through the music, a jagged tear in the fabric of the spectacle. For a moment, everything stopped. The trapeze artist, poised mid-swing, faltered. The calliope, moments ago shrieking its discordant tune, wheezed to a halt, its final note hanging in the hush like a death rattle. The audience, mere seconds before lost in applause and laughter, fell silent, their mirth dissolving into an uneasy murmur. And then, movement, a ripple of bodies twisting toward the source of the sound, a collective lurch of curiosity tipping into fear. Beyond the golden glow of the main tent, past the forgotten props and ropes coiled like sleeping serpents, a figure lay crumpled on the damp earth. Even in the dim flickering of lantern light, the identity was unmistakable. Lord Percival Ainsley, an aristocrat, whose wealth was whispered about in the same breath as his sins, lay motionless, his fine waistcoat marred by an unmistakable stain, dark and spreading. His face, frozen in an expression of bewildered protest, was turned just enough to catch the glow of the swaying lanterns, revealing eyes that had not yet registered fear, only the confusion of an interrupted thought. And then, the panic. A woman screamed, high and shrill, shattering the last fragile thread of silence. Someone stumbled backward into a pile of wooden crates, sending them crashing to the ground. The ringmaster, a man known for his unnerving composure, rushed forward with a sharp command for order, though his voice, usually as steady as a metronome, wavered on the edges of alarm. And amidst the growing chaos, Agatha Marple remained still. Seated at the outermost edge of the audience, she did not join the throng surging toward the scene. She watched how the villagers reacted, how some shrank back in fear, others leaned forward in grotesque fascination. She watched how the performers moved, how Raphael Dupont, the knife thrower, barely shifted, his fingers flexing once at his sides before stilling again, how Madame Claudine exhaled slowly, as if she had expected this, as if she had seen this moment in the stars. And most of all, she watched the body, because beyond the hysteria, beyond the whispers and questions that would soon sweep through St. Malo like wildfire, There was one undeniable, inescapable truth. Lord Ainsley had been murdered. His body lay awkwardly against the weathered boards of the backstage platform, his fine evening suit stark against the rough ink-dark wood. Above him, the lanterns swung, their uneven light catching on something metallic beneath the folds of his coat, a flicker of steel, half obscured, glinting with a wet sheen. The air was thick with the mingled scents of grease paint, sweat, and something sharper, the metallic tang of blood, impossible to ignore. Agatha Marple did not hesitate. With the calm efficiency of one who had seen death more times than she cared to count, she crouched beside the lifeless form, her gaze sweeping over the details, cataloguing them with practiced precision, before well-meaning hands could disturb the truth. His posture, the wound, the absence of struggle in his frozen features. But it was not the aristocrat's face that held her attention, it was the ground beneath him. A mark, faint but deliberate, had been scorched into the wooden boards beneath his body, a symbol neither accidental nor meaningless. And just beyond the reach of the lantern light, half hidden in the shadow of an abandoned stage prop, a towering painted crescent moon, a dagger gleamed in the dim light. The blade was long, the handle plain, the steel darkened with something that might have been blood. But was it the weapon, or merely a deception, placed with careful intent? Moreau's lips pressed into a thin line. Behind her, the air shifted, small, hesitant, the presence of someone on the edge of speech, a sharp inhale, barely audible over the murmur of the crowd. She did not turn, not yet, but she adjusted her posture slightly, making it clear that she had noted his presence. "You saw something," she said, her voice light, almost casual. The young man, no more than 20, a stagehand whose uniform hung loose on his wiry frame, stood just a few paces away, his hands trembling at his sides. His face, pallid in the shifting light, bore an expression not just of fear, but of something heavier, reluctant knowledge. His eyes darted, first to the dagger, then to the mark on the floor, then finally to Moreau's face, as if searching for some unspoken permission to speak. For a moment, he looked as though he might bolt into the darkness. But then, as if realizing that whatever he had seen could not be outrun, he exhaled, his shoulders sagging in resignation. "I didn't mean to see it," he whispered. Moreau said nothing. She simply waited, and in the quiet wait of that patience, the story began to unfold. A hush had settled over the carnival long before the first scream split the air, a tension threading through the swirling mist like an unspoken omen. The fortune-teller, Madame Solène, sat cross-legged at the entrance to her tent, her eyes half-lidded, fingers lightly tracing the rim of a delicate porcelain teacup, filled not with tea, but with something darker. Across the grounds, the strong man Sergei leaned down, his massive frame casting long jagged shadows against the lamplight, as he murmured something to the contortionist, who nodded once before vanishing into the night. The scent of damp earth, sawdust, and burnt oil curled through the evening air, mingling with the low hum of expectant whispers from the gathered crowd. And then it happened, a sound that did not belong. A strangled guttural cry, raw with horror, cut through the laughter, through the drumbeat of the performers, through the carefully orchestrated chaos. The trapeze artist, mid-swing, faltered for a heartbeat too long. A juggler lost control of his pins, the objects scattering noisily against the wooden stage. The murmurs swelled into something more panicked, more urgent, as every head turned toward the source of the disturbance, beyond the brightly painted wagons, past the line of torches flickering against the darkness, near the forgotten storage shed at the very edge of the carnival's reach. A figure lay sprawled across the dirt, limbs bent unnaturally, the opulence of his deep green velvet coat, stark against the mud and straw. Lord Benedict Aldridge, a man whose wealth dripped from his very presence, lay still, his face turned just enough that the dim lantern light caught the frozen terror in his wide, glassy eyes. A dark stain spread across his crisp white cravat, a slow seep of crimson staining the once pristine fabric. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, as if a spell had shattered, the tension snapped. A woman gasped, another let out a shrill cry, and in the rush of movement, a metal bucket was kicked over, clattering loudly against the cobblestones. The carnival master, Monsieur Bellamy, pushed through the crowd, his sharp features twisted into a mask of barely restrained horror. "Stay back," he barked, though his own voice quivered ever so slightly. Not everyone obeyed. From the edges of the dispersing crowd, Inspector Sabine Moreau did not lurch forward as the others did. She did not cry out, did not move to cover her mouth in horror. Instead, she observed the way Sergei's thick fingers flexed and curled at his sides. Observed how Madame Selene exhaled, slow and measured, her gaze fixed not on the body, but on the sky. Observed how, in the very back, a young boy gripped the edge of a wooden crate, his knuckles white, his lips pressed together, as if holding in a secret that begged to be free. Most of all, she observed the body, because of course there was one irrefutable truth. Lord Eldridge had not simply fallen victim to some tragic accident, no. He had been murdered. The shed's door, slightly ajar, creaked in the wind, revealing a glimpse of something metallic half hidden in the shadows. Moreau crouched beside the lifeless form, her keen eyes tracing every detail with quiet precision. The dirt around him bore faint disturbances, not the frantic scuffle of a struggle, but the calculated marks of a body dragged. He had not died here. He had been placed here, arranged, and beneath him, pressed into the soil, was a symbol, a spiral, burned into the earth as if seared there by something unnatural. The significance of it, she did not yet know, but she would. She always did. The scent of blood was thick in the air, coppery and sharp, mingling with the scent of burnt wood. Just beside the shed, partially buried beneath scattered straw, a dagger lay gleaming in the dim light. The blade was long, the handle plain, unremarkable, except for the deep red coating its length. A weapon, certainly, but the weapon, or simply a piece in a much larger game. A sharp inhale drew her attention. A young man, barely more than a boy, stood just beyond the reach of the flickering torchlight. His carnival uniform was slightly too large for his wiry frame, and his hands trembled at his sides, his face pale, eyes darting from the dagger to the symbol to the unmoving form of Lord Eldridge. For a moment, he looked as if he might run. Moreau did not move, did not reach for him. Instead, she merely tilted her head, her voice light, conversational. "You saw something." The boy swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing violently. "No, the words were brittle, crumbling before they could fully take shape. Moreau exhaled softly, patient. She had encountered his kind before, the ones who knew more than they wished to, who had not yet reconciled with the weight of their knowledge. "Come now," she murmured, her gaze flickering back to the dagger. "We both know that isn't true." His fingers clenched into fists. His entire body seemed to waver, caught between confession and flight. Then, in a sudden burst, he whispered, "It's not what it looks like." The words tumbled out, urgent, desperate. "It's not." Moreau's eyes sharpened. "That is interesting," she mused. "And what, precisely, does it look like to you?" He opened his mouth, hesitated, then as if realizing he had already said too much, snapped it shut. The silence stretched. He stared at her, something like pleading in his wide eyes. Moreau let the quiet linger, let it settle over them like a slow-moving tide. The trick was not to press. Not yet. They always spoke eventually. Outside, the carnival moved on, its performers and patrons murmuring in hushed, uneasy tones. But here, in the flickering lantern glow, a far greater performance was unfolding, one of deceit, of long-buried secrets, of a game that had only just begun. And Inspector Sabine Moreau fully intended to see it through to the end. A hush had settled over the grand pavilion, its once vibrant banners hanging limp in the still night air. Beyond the canvas walls, The restless murmur of the circus folk was punctuated by the occasional clink of metal or the scuff of hurried footsteps on damp soil. But within the performers' quarters, a different tension coiled, a breath held too long, a silence thick with unsaid things. Detective Evelyn March stood in the dim glow of a flickering lantern, her sharp gaze fixed on the man seated before her. Lucien Vance, the blade dancer, renowned for his precision and feared for the whispers that trailed his name, sat with his arms folded, his lean frame taut as a wire drawn too tight. His jaw twitched as he met her gaze, the wariness of a man who had long learned that innocence was rarely enough. "You were seen near the supply wagon last night," March said, her voice measured, her notebook resting lightly in her gloved hands. Vance exhaled slowly, shaking his head, and, "A man can't walk without being accused of murder." There was steel in his voice, but the brief flicker of his eyes to the corner of the room betrayed him. March followed the glance, her gaze landing on a worn leather satchel tucked beneath a trunk. She stepped forward, slow and deliberate. "Lucien, the problem with places like this," she murmured, crouching beside the trunk, "is that every movement has an audience." Her fingers brushed the satchel's handle, and Vance's entire body stiffened. In the dim light, she saw the dried smear of something dark at its corner. "Explain this," she said, lifting the satchel onto the table between them. The flickering lantern caught the shifting shadows in his face, the struggle of a man weighing his words. Then, with a sharp exhale, he leaned forward. "I didn't kill him," he muttered, "but I saw something. Someone." March arched an eyebrow, her silence urging him onward. "There was a woman," he said at last, voice low, "not one of ours. She met Witherspoon near the edge of camp. They argued." He looked, afraid. March's pen moved swiftly across the page, but her thoughts moved faster. A man like Witherspoon did not frighten easily. She straightened, nodding once. "Thank you, Mr. Vance. That will be all for now." As she stepped back into the cold night air, the circus lay before her, a world of smoke and secrets. Somewhere among these flickering lights and painted faces, the truth lurked, waiting to be unearthed. And March had every intention of finding it. The dim glow of the candelabra cast flickering shadows along the ornate walls of Pembroke Hall, the heavy scent of lavender and old parchment thick in the air. Miss Evelyn March, her gloved fingers poised over a slender notepad, regarded Lady Eleanor with a measured gaze, the silence stretching just long enough to unsettle. "Miss March," Eleanor murmured at last, her voice low and guarded, "if you are implying something untoward." "Not at all," Evelyn interrupted smoothly, her pencil barely whispering against the paper. "Merely seeking clarity." Lady Eleanor hesitated, the tension in her delicate frame betraying the weight of unspoken truths. A breath, slow and resigned, left her lips. "Yes," she admitted, barely above a whisper, "Lord Hargrove frequented Pembroke Hall. He sought guidance on private matters." Evelyn's gaze sharpened. Matters that might involve the traveling show. A faint flush crept along Eleanor's throat, her hands folding tightly in her lap. "I wouldn't know," she replied, too quickly. Before Evelyn could press further, the door creaked open, its sound slicing through the stillness like a blade. A man entered, tall, sharply dressed, his every movement precise, deliberate, the ringmaster. His polished boots made no sound upon the Persian rug, his long coat a dark river of fabric. With a practiced ease, he removed his hat, revealing piercing eyes that held the room in their grip. "Detective," he greeted, his voice a study in velvet. "I trust you don't object to my presence. I hear I am next in line." If Evelyn was surprised, she did not show it, not at all. Lady Eleanor stood abruptly, the ghost of her former composure slipping back into place. "If you'll excuse me, I believe our conversation is concluded." She vanished through the door without another word. The ringmaster watched her go, a faint, unreadable smile playing at his lips before he turned and lowered himself into the chair she had vacated. "I must admit, I am curious," he said, resting his cane against his knee. "How exactly may I assist you?" Evelyn studied him, her expression impassive. His tone was pleasant, yet something about the controlled stillness of his posture, the faintly amused glint in his eyes, suggested careful calculation. "You've been with the traveling show for years," she noted. "Indeed," he acknowledged. "And you knew Lord Hargrove?" "Knew of him," the ringmaster corrected, his smile unwavering, though a shadow flickered behind his eyes. He was fascinated by the spectacle, the art of illusion. A connoisseur, if you will. Evelyn leaned forward. "And yet he was found behind the curtain of the grand stage the night he died." The ringmaster's grip on his cane tightened, ever so slightly. "An unfortunate coincidence, no doubt." Evelyn arched an eyebrow. "You were there, of course," he admitted, his voice smooth. "As ringmaster, I ensure the performance unfolds seamlessly. I watch over my troupe, my stage." She tilted her head. "Or perhaps you ensure that certain things remain unseen." A crack, small but unmistakable, fractured his carefully constructed composure. His jaw set, his shoulders stiffened. But Evelyn saw it. "I assure you," he said, quieter now, "I have nothing to conceal." Evelyn offered a faint smile, her gaze unwavering. "We shall see." Later, at the Gilded Rose Tea House, the soft chime of porcelain and hushed conversation filled the air, the scent of bergamot mingling with the patter of rain upon the windows. Evelyn sat at a small corner table, her teacup untouched, her pencil gliding methodically across crisp pages. One by one, witnesses, circus performers, theatre patrons, house staff, offered their accounts of that fateful night. "I was in the fortune-teller's tent," murmured Madame Claudine, her French accent lilting yet firm. She folded her hands neatly in her lap, her crimson nails glinting in the lamplight. "She reads the cards for me, helps to still my nerves before a performance." Evelyn looked up, her blue eyes cool, probing. "And what time was that, precisely?" Madame Claudine's lips curved in a measured smile. "Just after the grand act concluded, perhaps a few minutes past midnight. But you understand, time is such a fluid thing when one dances with fate." Across the table, a figure shifted, and Evelyn turned her attention to the next piece of the puzzle. The gaslights along Blackwood Lane sputtered in the cold wind, casting flickering pools of light upon the damp cobblestones. The night held its breath, as if waiting for something unseen to stir. Detective Evelyn Carrington moved with practiced silence, her footsteps barely a whisper against the glistening stones. A low fog clung to the ground, curling between the narrow alleyways, like ghostly fingers, and in the distance, the sound of a church bell tolled, slow and deliberate. A reminder of passing time, of things lost to the dark. She had followed the whispers, each clue leading her deeper into the decayed remnants of the Holloway Theatre, a place that had once been filled with laughter and applause, now nothing more than a skeleton of forgotten performances and secrets too dangerous to be left in the light. The scent of damp wood and old velvet hung heavy in the air, a place frozen in time, where dust and memories settled thick upon the peeling wallpaper. The towering wooden doors before her were slightly ajar, shifting with a slow creak as the wind urged them inward. A faint glow seeped from within, not the warm flicker of candlelight, but something colder, something unnatural. She inhaled, steadying herself before slipping inside. The silence here was different, heavy, watchful. The theatre's grandeur had long since faded, its grand chandelier hanging like a forgotten relic, crystals dulled with grime. The air smelled of old performances, of grease paint and damp upholstery, and yet beneath it all was something else, something metallic, blood. Evelyn's sharp gaze followed the wavering glow to the stage, where 5 figures stood, their faces obscured beneath deep hoods of varying darkness. They were still too still, as if waiting for an unseen cue. Between them sat an open trunk, lined with crimson velvet, the kind used for expensive costumes. But what it cradled was no mere attire. A gloved hand reached inside, drawing out a silk-wrapped object, unwrapping it with slow deliberate movements. The dagger that emerged gleamed under the dim light, its handle adorned with silver filigree, the blade darkened with something old, something that should have long been forgotten. The silence deepened. "We should have left it buried," a voice murmured, barely above a breath, yet weighted with unspoken fear. "And yet here we are," another answered. This voice was different, measured, theatrical, as if accustomed to weaving tales and illusions. The shifting light caught the edge of a painted mask beneath the hood, an eerie remnant of performances long since ended. Evelyn remained in the shadows, her heart beat steady, her mind working through the pieces. They were afraid of what? She couldn't yet say. But fear had a scent, and it filled the Holloway Theatre tonight. "Do you think he knew?" the first voice asked again. A scoff. "Withers, if he did, he knew too much." There it was, the name. A thread connecting this ghostly meeting to Lord Ashford, Withers' untimely demise. His body discovered in his study, a single candle burned down to its base beside him, the words carved into his mahogany desk, still a mystery. His death had been ruled inconclusive, yet rumors had persisted, whispers of an old debt, a vanished heirloom, a secret buried within the ruins of this forgotten theatre. And now, standing before her, were the very players in a tragedy still unfolding. And the detective, the masked figure asked, voice sharp, wary. "She asks too many questions." Evelyn pressed further into the darkness, her pulse steady but her mind racing. The game was shifting, the curtain rising on a new act she hadn't yet read. Whatever had begun within these walls had not yet reached its final bow. The flickering candlelight cast strange elongated shadows against the peeling wallpaper, twisting the figures on stage into something almost inhuman. The scent of candle wax thickened, the flames wavering as though responding to some unseen force. Something was about to be decided in this room, and she had mere moments before she too became part of this silent performance. The lantern's flame wavered like a dying breath, its flickering light carving grotesque shadows across the uneven stone walls. In a tight, ritualistic formation, cloaked figures stood encircling the dim glow, their bodies unnaturally still, faces concealed within the folds of their hoods. The air vibrated with an eerie hum, a rhythmic chant spoken in a tongue that did not belong to the present. At first, the words were indecipherable, whispers woven into the darkness, but as Marla edged closer, pressing herself against the cold, damp wall, a single phrase emerged from the murmurs, sending a jolt through her veins: "Sanguis ligat, lumina perit." The blood binds, the light reveals. Her breath caught. She had seen those very words before, etched into the rotting wooden beams of Lord Averton's abandoned estate, scrawled in a hand unsteady with either fear or reverence. Her fingers grazed the worn leather of the journal at her hip, the same journal that contained centuries-old records of disappearances, men and women who had walked into the shadows of the Holloway district, never to be seen again. This was no mere performance. One of the figures stepped forward, their movement deliberate, precise. In the lantern's frail glow, something metallic glinted in their gloved hand, a dagger, its hilt adorned with symbols so ancient, they might as well have been written in the bones of the earth. The murmurs deepened, their cadence almost hypnotic, a sound that seemed to coil around the air itself. Then, silence. A pause so thick, so unnatural, it pressed against Marla's skin like a physical force. The leader raised the dagger higher, the blade catching the light in a way that made it look wet, though whether with oil or something far darker, she could not tell. And then came the motion, slow, practiced, a downward arc as if sealing something unseen into the very ground they stood upon. Marla knew she should retreat, that her presence here was a gamble she could not afford to lose. But something held her rooted in place, a pull stronger than fear, deeper than logic. Her mind raced back to the murder, the way Lord Averton's body had been positioned, the symbols carved into his flesh, the single candle burning low beside him, its wax pooled unnaturally as if untouched by time. Everything in her gut told her this was not coincidence. The dagger, the chant, the way the air itself seemed to shift within this hidden space. It was all connected. Then, as if sensing her thoughts, the leader's hood tilted slightly, their posture shifting just enough to make her pulse lurch. The stillness was absolute, stretching unbearably before a single voice cut through it. "The eye watches," it said, the words barely more than a breath, but weighted with something ancient, something that made Marla's blood run cold. The figures did not move. They did not need to. Because in that moment, she knew, they were aware of her. Marla spun on her heel, moving as swiftly and silently as the tight passage would allow. The corridor twisted before her, the air thick with the scent of aged stone and something more metallic beneath it. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears, drowning out every other sound until clink, a noise ahead. She skidded to a halt, breath shallow, pressing herself into the darkness. A figure stood at the corridor's edge, barely an outline in the dim light. For a moment, she thought they had not seen her. Then, slow as death itself, they lifted a single gloved finger to their lips. A warning, a promise. She did not wait to understand which. A dim lantern flickered in the depths of the abandoned estate, its weak glow casting elongated shadows against the peeling wallpaper and broken furniture. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and something else, something metallic, like rust or dried blood. In the center of the room, 6 figures stood in a loose circle, their heads bowed in silent reverence. The only sound was a whisper, low, rhythmic, threading through the silence like an incantation spoken from a time long forgotten. The syllables were unfamiliar, but they carried a weight that sent an involuntary shiver down Elira Moreau's spine. She crouched behind the splintered remnants of an old writing desk, barely daring to breathe as she strained to catch their words. Vos hombres vocat, sanguis debitur, oculus apatus est. The chant rose and fell, their voices weaving into something more than speech, something that felt alive. One of them stepped forward, the dim light catching the glint of something in their hand, a key, or a blade, its edges sharp enough to gleam even in the meager glow. Elira's pulse pounded in her ears. She had spent years chasing phantoms, lost truths hidden beneath layers of dust and deception, but this was something else entirely. She had followed a trail of symbols, carved into doorframes and alley walls, burned into the floorboards of crime scenes, scattered like breadcrumbs leading her here. What she had once dismissed as coincidence had taken on an eerie clarity in the presence of these figures, their ritual precise, deliberate, ancient. The sigil she had seen etched onto the victim's skin, a twisted looping emblem that defied logic, was mirrored in the arrangement of their circle, in the cadence of their murmured devotion. The realization settled like ice in her gut. This was no ordinary gathering. This was the key to everything. Then, as if responding to an unseen cue, the figures fell silent. A breathless pause followed, thick with expectation. The stillness was oppressive, like the air itself was waiting for something to emerge from the shadows. Elira knew she had lingered too long. She began to back away, one step at a time, careful to keep her movements soundless. But just as she reached the edge of the doorway, a floorboard creaked beneath her heel, a sound impossibly loud in the hush. The nearest figure's head snapped up, and for the first time, Elira saw their eyes, black, reflective, like polished obsidian. A slow, knowing smile crept across their lips. "Elira," the voice came, smooth and amused. "We've been expecting you." A jolt of adrenaline shot through her, but before she could react, the lantern flame guttered, plunging the room into darkness. The whispers resumed, now layered with something else, a rustling movement, a presence shifting in the black void beyond her sight. And then, from behind her, a voice whispered against her ear, impossibly close. "Run." The air around Blackwood Manor was thick with an uneasy stillness, the kind that settles before a storm. The moon hung low, casting pale light over the twisted iron gates and the ivy-choked statues that loomed like forgotten sentinels. At the heart of the overgrown garden, beneath a gnarled oak, a gathering had formed, a cluster of figures, their faces half lit by the flickering glow of an oil lantern. At their center stood Eleanor Graves, her sharp eyes scanning the group with quiet intensity. She had spent the past week unraveling a tapestry of secrets, each thread leading back to this place, to this moment. The whispers in the village, the strange markings found scorched into the wood of the old stagecoach, the cryptic letters hidden in the library of the murdered Lord Ashford, all had led her here, to the shadowed depths of the estate, where truth lay buried beneath layers of deception. To her left, the illusionist Marcus Vale adjusted the cuff of his dark coat, his usual air of effortless charm replaced by something taut, wary. Beside him, the seamstress Anya Braithwaite clutched her shawl tightly around her shoulders, her fingers trembling. And then there was Rafe Calloway, the circus's blade master, standing apart from the others, his face a mask of quiet resolve. Eleanor fixed her gaze on him, her voice calm but unyielding. "You know why we're here," she said. "The symbols, the whispers, the deaths, they are not coincidences. They are part of something far older, something hidden beneath the illusions we call reality." A tense silence followed. The wind stirred the trees, rustling the brittle leaves like unseen hands shifting in the darkness. Marcus let out a slow breath. "You're suggesting a conspiracy," he said, though his tone lacked true skepticism. "Not a conspiracy," Eleanor corrected. "A ritual, one that has been practiced in secret for generations." The symbols etched into Lord Ashford's floorboards matched the ones carved beneath the old stage. The same sigil found on the underside of the ringmaster's carriage, a pattern too precise to ignore. Anya swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. "Then, he was killed for discovering it?" Eleanor nodded. "He found something he was never meant to see, and someone made sure he wouldn't speak of it." All eyes turned to Rafe. He met Eleanor's gaze, his jaw tightening. "You already know the answer," he murmured. "Say it," she pressed. He exhaled, his shoulders shifting as if he were shedding a weight he had carried for too long. "I've seen them before," he admitted. "The sigils, the gatherings. At first I thought they were nothing, old superstitions, traditions passed down through the circus. But then, I saw what they really meant. I saw what they were willing to do to keep their secrets." A hush fell over the group, thick with the weight of unspoken fears. "Then we know what must be done," Eleanor said softly. "But if we move against them, we must be prepared. Because once they realize we've seen the truth." A branch snapped somewhere beyond the gate. A figure lurked just beyond the lantern's reach, watching. Rafe's voice was grim. "Then we may not live to tell it." The rain whispered against the glass panes of Blackmore House, streaking the old leaded windows in silver trails, while the cold wind carried with it the scent of damp earth and secrets long buried. Outside, the trees groaned under the weight of the storm, their skeletal branches clawing at the night sky as if in silent warning. Inside, the candlelit study was a world apart, warm, yet suffocating, every flickering shadow a silent spectator to the confrontation unfolding within. Eleanor Vale stood motionless, her gloved fingers trailing along the spine of an aged leather-bound journal, her piercing gaze sweeping across the assembled figures before her. The air crackled with unspoken tension, thick with something unsaid, something known yet desperately avoided. Across from her, Vincent Holloway, the esteemed proprietor of the Blackmore Grand Theatre, sat stiff-backed in his armchair, his usual air of practiced elegance cracking at the edges. He had always been a man of control, a master of illusion, but now his carefully maintained composure seemed fragile, a mask slipping ever so slightly. Beside him, Lydia Ravenscroft, the theatre's silent benefactor, clutched at the pearls around her neck, her knuckles white, her breath unsteady. A woman accustomed to wielding influence from behind closed doors, yet now in the face of the undeniable, she looked small, diminished. Then there was Rafe Durant, the stagehand whose reluctance to speak had drawn Eleanor's sharpest scrutiny. He stood apart from the others, his wiry frame tense, his jaw set in defiance yet betrayed by the fear flickering behind his eyes. He knew something, something dark enough to weigh on his conscience, yet for too long, he had kept it buried beneath layers of silence and self-preservation. "You all know why we are here," Eleanor said at last, her voice a calm thread against the storm beyond. "The death of Lord Whittaker was no accident, nor was it a random act of violence. It was calculated, precise, executed by someone who understood exactly what they were doing." The firelight cast elongated shadows over the velvet drapes, turning the faces around her into something almost otherworldly, something haunted. A hush fell upon the room, the crackle of burning wood, the only defiance to the silence. For decades the Blackmore Grand Theatre has been more than a place of performance, she continued, her fingers tracing the edge of the journal she had retrieved from Whittaker's study. It has been a front, a veil behind which something older, something far more dangerous has continued to thrive. A ritual masked beneath the guise of tradition, a cycle that has repeated itself through whispered incantations, hidden symbols, and blood sacrifices, always unseen, always denied. Vincent scoffed, though his voice held none of its usual certainty. "Miss Vale, this is absurd. You have no proof, only conjecture." His fingers tightened around the armrests of his chair, betraying the controlled indifference he tried so desperately to maintain. Eleanor's lips curled in a faint smile, one devoid of warmth. "No proof." She turned a page in the journal, her gaze unwavering. "Then explain why Lord Whittaker, in his final days, wrote of a symbol found beneath the theatre's main stage, one identical to the markings found on the carriage doors of your most trusted performers. Explain why he was investigating the sudden disappearances of those who work too closely with your inner circle." Her eyes shifted, pinning Rafe beneath their weight. "And explain why Mr. Durant here, despite his silence, carries the burden of knowledge none of you wish to acknowledge." All eyes turned to Rafe, the silence pressing in around him, suffocating. His face was pale, the flickering candlelight casting hollows across his sharp features. He had always been an observer, a man who knew when to keep his head down, when to turn away. But this was different. This was the moment he had dreaded. His fingers clenched into fists at his sides, a slow breath shaking free from his chest. "It wasn't always like this," he said at last, his voice hoarse, distant. "At first, it was just a story, something passed down through the years. The theatre had its traditions, small offerings left behind, strange words muttered before performances. I thought it was just superstition." He swallowed hard. "But then I started noticing things. The way new recruits were treated differently, the nights when only a select few were allowed into the back rooms, the whispers of an unseen patron, one who ensured the theatre's prosperity, at a cost." Lydia shuddered, pressing a trembling hand to her lips. "Dear God," she whispered, as though finally grasping the gravity of what lay beneath the surface of their lives. Rafe's eyes flickered with something darker, something raw. Lord Whittaker found out. He started asking questions. He realized the plays performed here weren't chosen at random, that certain scripts, certain words, carried weight. He confronted the wrong person. Vincent's composure fractured, his fist slamming against the arm of his chair. "Enough." The word rang through the room like the crack of a whip, an attempt to silence the inevitable. Eleanor remained unmoved, her expression unreadable. "No, Mr. Holloway," she said softly. "I believe we have only just begun." The storm clawed at the windows of Blackthorn Manor, wind wailing through the skeletal trees outside, as if mourning the secrets buried beneath the ancient estate. Inside the drawing room, firelight flickered over tense faces, illuminating the heavy silence that stretched between the assembled figures. Lady Isadora Hawthorne sat with rigid poise, her pale fingers locked around the arm of her chair, but there was a tremor in her grip, a fleeting crack in the composure she had long mastered. Across from her, Donovan Graves, the enigmatic financier of the Hollow Vale Theatre, leaned forward, his polished cane resting against his knee, his gloved fingers tracing the brass serpent coiled around its handle. A man accustomed to wielding power from the shadows, his expression betrayed only the faintest flicker of unease. Beside him, Evelyn Harrow, the theatre's lead actress, clutched the folds of her emerald gown, her breath unsteady, the illusion of confidence faltering beneath the weight of what had been spoken. And then there was Alias Crowe, the silent observer, the one who had spent years piecing together the whispers, the missing names, the sudden disappearances veiled beneath the spectacle of grand performances. His gaze lingered on the thick journal resting on the mahogany table between them. Its cracked leather cover bore the insignia of the Hollow Vale Theatre, and its pages held the truth that none had dared to speak. "You know why we're here," murmured Magdalene Wolfe, the investigator whose quiet intensity had already unraveled their carefully woven pretenses. Her voice was measured, deliberate, each syllable carrying a weight that sent a shiver through the room. Lord Alistair Whitmore's death was no tragic accident, nor was it the work of some nameless assailant. It was precise, it was inevitable, and it was orchestrated by someone in this very room. The fire crackled, the only sound in the suffocating stillness. Magdalene's gaze shifted, lingering on each face in turn, reading the minute shifts in posture, the tightness of a jaw, the darting of a glance. For decades the Hollow Vale Theatre has been more than just a stage. It has been a sanctuary for something far older, something far darker, an ancient rite masked beneath the guise of tradition, rituals woven into performances, symbols hidden in stage designs, scripts laced with incantations too old to be remembered by name. A covenant made long before any of you took your place within its walls. Donovan scoffed, though there was no real amusement in the sound. "Miss Wolfe, these are fairy tales spun from shadows. You have nothing but speculation." His fingers tightened around the cane, betraying his controlled facade. Magdalene lifted the journal, opening to a specific page worn with use. "No proof," she echoed. "Then explain why Lord Whitmore, in his final weeks, documented the strange inscriptions found beneath the theatre's main stage, the same symbols etched onto the belongings of those who vanished without a trace. Explain why he traced the finances of the Hollow Vale Theatre back to an unknown benefactor, a man whose name never appeared on any ledger, yet whose influence dictated every major decision." Her gaze locked onto Elias Crowe. "And explain why you, Mr. Crowe, have spent years watching from the sidelines, gathering secrets you never intended to share, until now." All eyes turned to Elias, the weight of unspoken truths pressing down on him like a vice. His jaw clenched, his breath slow, steady, but his fingers twitched against his sleeve, a sign of restraint barely maintained. "It was never just a performance," he said at last, his voice raw, edged with something close to regret. "It was a contract. Every season, a new production carefully selected, every line spoken with purpose. The audience thought they were witnessing art, but they were part of something much older, a cycle that demanded renewal, and when someone threatened to break that cycle, he exhaled sharply. Lord Whitmore saw what no one else dared to see. He followed the trail too far, and when he reached the truth, he became the next name on the ledger of the forgotten." Evelyn paled, her hands trembling in her lap. "Dear God," she whispered, as if saying it aloud might offer some absolution. Elias shook his head. "God has nothing to do with it. This is about power, about those who hold it, and those who are sacrificed to maintain it." Donovan's mask of indifference finally cracked, his fist slamming against the chair's arm. "Enough." His voice rang out like a thunderclap, an attempt to silence the inevitable. But Magdalene only smiled, slow and knowing, as she closed the journal with deliberate finality. "No, Mr. Graves," she said softly, "we have only just begun." The wind howled through the high arched windows of Blackthorn Hall, rattling the stained glass like the whispers of the restless dead. A single candle flickered on the grand mahogany table, its frail glow barely enough to illuminate the grim expressions of those gathered. The air was thick with something unseen, an unspoken truth clawing its way to the surface. At the head of the room, Arabella Vaughan stood motionless, her dark eyes sharp beneath the weight of revelation. The magistrate, a stern man with a face carved from years of law and order, shifted in his seat, his fingers drumming against the armrest. Across from him, Lord Whitlow, the town's most influential benefactor, sat with his shoulders rigid, his polished cane resting against his knee, though his knuckles whitened where they gripped its silver wolf's head. To his right, Eleanor Finch, the famed opera singer whose voice could ensnare a crowd, clutched her lace handkerchief so tightly it threatened to tear. Beside her, Nicholas Graves, the reclusive scholar whose knowledge of the occult was whispered about in hushed tones, leaned forward ever so slightly, his spectacles catching the dim light as he observed in silence. "The question we must ask ourselves," Arabella finally spoke, her voice a blade cutting through the suffocating silence, "is whether we are dealing with a conspiracy woven into the very fabric of our town, or the calculated actions of one person." The room remained deathly still. Lord Alcott did not simply fall to his death. His body was found at the base of the cathedral bell tower, his limbs twisted unnaturally, his face frozen in terror. But more curious still, she lifted a weathered piece of parchment from the table, its edges burned as if it had been hastily destroyed. Was the symbol branded onto his palm, a mark of the Order of the Hollow Veil? A sharp intake of breath from Eleanor. The magistrate's gaze darkened. "An order," Arabella continued, her voice tightening, "that was thought to have died out centuries ago." "Impossible," Lord Whitlow scoffed, though his voice lacked conviction. "The Hollow Veil was a tale told to frighten children, an old superstition, nothing more." Arabella turned to Nicholas Graves. "And yet, Mr. Graves, your research suggests otherwise, does it not?" Graves hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Indeed, the Hollow Veil was never truly eradicated. Its members operated in secrecy, binding their rituals to the art of performance, music, theatre, grand illusions. The townspeople were none the wiser, attending lavish productions unaware that they were witnessing something far darker than mere entertainment." "Ridiculous," Whitlow snapped, shifting in his chair. "You would have us believe that a cabal of ritualists has been operating under our noses for generations." Arabella took a slow step forward, her gaze never leaving his. "And if that were the case, Lord Whitlow, would it not explain the peculiar disappearances, the performers who arrived for the winter festival and were never seen again, the scholars who dared to investigate and were found drowned in the river, their throats slit in a precise manner?" Eleanor shivered visibly. "But why Lord Alcott?" she whispered. "What did he uncover?" Arabella placed a hand on the journal lying open before her. He was close. He had begun to piece together the names, the financial transactions linking the old theatre to certain benefactors, the hidden messages in the festival performances. And then, she trailed off, letting the implication hang. A hush fell over the room, the weight of realization pressing down upon them. "You mean to say," the magistrate's voice was a low growl, "that someone in this very room had reason to silence him?" No one answered. No one had to. The candle flickered violently, its flame nearly extinguished by an unseen force. Arabella exhaled, stepping back into the shadows, her next words spoken with an eerie certainty. "Justice is inevitable. Whether it be tonight or in the days to come, the truth will reveal itself. And when it does," her gaze swept across them, lingering on the tension carved into every face, the cracks forming in their carefully curated facades, "there will be no escaping it." The air in Blackmere Hall was thick with unspoken truths, the heavy drapes absorbing the murmurs that hovered just beneath the surface. The grand chandelier cast fractured light upon the gathering, flickering as if sensing the tension that had seeped into every corner of the room. At the center of it all, Seraphina Vale stood unmoved, her presence alone enough to still the shifting glances, the nervous hands wringing beneath the polished table. She had followed the thread of deception for too long, and now it had led her here to this moment, where the weight of her revelations would either shatter the illusion, or ensnare them all in a darkness they could never escape. Lord Ashford sat rigid, his fingers drumming against the mahogany surface, a single bead of sweat tracing a path down his temple. Lady Evangeline, her pearl necklace rising and falling with each labored breath, stole a glance at the massive portrait above the fireplace, an oil-painted spectre of the very man whose sudden disappearance had set this chain of events into motion. And in the shadows, barely illuminated by the flickering gaslights, was Tobias Wren, the puppeteer of the stage, his expression a careful mask, yet the faint tightening of his jaw betrayed the weight pressing upon him. Seraphina stepped forward, her voice smooth, deliberate. "We play a dangerous game when we mistake silence for safety, but I assure you, there is no safety here, only the truth, and the consequences that come with it." Her gaze drifted across the room, watching how the tension rippled through them, how secrets threatened to spill from trembling lips. "For months we have believed the disappearances to be mere misfortune. We have told ourselves that the whispers of hidden symbols, of cryptic messages left in the library, were nothing more than old superstitions." She reached into her coat pocket, withdrawing a small time-worn envelope. But this, she held it up, her fingers firm, unyielding, was found in the study, in a locked drawer belonging to none other than Lord Ashford himself. The Lord stiffened, his drumming fingers stilling at once. "It is a letter," Seraphina continued, "written by Elias Morgrave, the last man to vanish without a trace. And in it, he speaks of a gathering that was to take place the very night he disappeared. A meeting where secrets would be revealed, where certain names were to be spoken aloud, names that would unravel everything." She turned the envelope over, her fingers running along the broken wax seal. But he never had the chance to finish it, because someone ensured that he never spoke again. A sharp intake of breath. The room constricted around them. Lady Evangeline's hand trembled against her pearls. Tobias Wren's smirk faltered, his eyes narrowing in the dim light. Lord Ashford's expression darkened, his lips pressing into a thin line. Seraphina let the silence stretch before she stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "We have spent too long pretending that the stage is merely a stage, that the performances, the symbols, the meetings held in locked rooms, they mean nothing. But Elias knew better, and now so do I." She turned to Lord Ashford, her voice unwavering. "Tell me, my lord, do you?" The room held its breath. Shadows flickered. The truth once buried beneath years of deception was clawing its way to the surface, and before the night was over, there would be nowhere left to hide. The garden, bathed in the dim glow of moonlight, felt strangely heavier than before, its silence not one of peace, but of waiting. The scent of damp earth mingled with the lingering trace of night jasmine, wrapping the air in a heady mix of decay and renewal. Each step he took seemed to press deeper into the damp soil, as if the very ground beneath him sought to root him in place, to bind him to the weight of what had been set into motion. He had spoken the truth, pulled it from the shadows, but now as the wind whispered through the hedges, he realized confession was never an ending, merely the first cut of a blade that would continue to carve its path. His name would be whispered in hushed voices behind closed doors, dissected in candle-lit parlors where the scent of old secrets clung to velvet curtains. But what did it matter now? He had chosen the path, and there was no return. A rustling in the darkness made him stiffen, the faintest scrape of movement, a hesitation in the air itself. He turned sharply, heart hammering, expecting to see a familiar face twisted in accusation. But the garden remained his alone, its hedges trembling under an unseen hand. Still the feeling did not leave him. Someone had been watching. Someone had listened. He exhaled, allowing his body to relax, but only just. The house beyond the garden was alive with flickering candlelight, the shifting silhouettes of those still speaking within casting elongated figures against the stained glass. Their words would build like a storm, rippling outwards in waves, sweeping through the town, through every corridor of the manor. And when the tide receded, would he still be standing, or would he be dragged beneath its weight? Inside the drawing room of Blackthorn Manor was thick with tension, the grand ceiling pressing down upon the assembled group like a watchful eye. The candle flames flickered, their glow catching upon the polished brass fixtures, distorting the faces of those gathered. Agatha Marple stood at the heart of it all, her gaze sharp, her hands resting upon the back of a high-backed chair. Around her, the players sat in uneasy silence. Lady Eleanor Pembroke, perched stiffly upon the velvet settee, her pearl-gloved hands twisting a lace handkerchief. The ringmaster, leaning against the fireplace, his cane resting at his side, his expression unreadable. And then there was Julian Blackwood, poised, deliberate, his every movement a practiced gesture of detachment. But beneath the surface, something coiled, waiting. Agatha's voice cut through the silence, cool and measured. "We stand at the edge of the truth. Once spoken, there will be no undoing it. No retreat, only consequence." Her gaze swept across the room, lingering for the briefest moment on Julian. It began as these things often do, with a death that seemed at first glance to be merely another stroke of misfortune. But misfortune, as we know, is rarely so precise. It is rarely so calculated. A breathless stillness. The fireplace crackled, its glow unable to push back the chill that settled over them. Lord Witherspoon was murdered. Agatha continued, her voice unwavering. Not by chance, not by folly, but because he uncovered what was never meant to be seen. A secret buried beneath the guise of performance and spectacle. A truth so dangerous that it could not be allowed to reach the light. Julian Blackwood did not flinch, but something in the set of his jaw tightened. The others shifted, the weight of her words pressing into their bones. "For years the circus has been a mask," Agatha went on, her fingers tightening against the chair. "A perfect illusion under which something far more insidious has lurked. A gathering, hidden in plain sight. A society not lost to history, but merely waiting in the shadows for its moment to rise again." A flicker of something passed through Julian's eyes, quick as a blade. "The truth," Agatha said, taking a step closer, "is that Lord Witherspoon did not stumble upon a mere secret. He uncovered a machine built to ensnare, to control, to eliminate those who strayed too close. And at the helm of that machine was you." The air in the room seemed to thin, drawing every breath taut. Julian tilted his head ever so slightly, his expression unreadable, his lips parting as if to speak, yet no word. Outside in the garden, the wind stirred again. This time it did not whisper, it howled. A heavy air settled over the grand drawing room of Blackwood Estate, where moonlight filtered through the tall windows, casting pale illumination over ancient bookshelves and brass-engraved medals. A strange silence lingered, one that only occurs when the truth is on the verge of being unmasked. Inspector Eleanor Graves stood among the towering stone pillars, the very ones where Sir Reginald Fairfax had once revelled in his power. But now his once commanding presence had withered. His eyes remained fixed on the high-backed chair in which he sat, not with his usual rigid posture, but slouched, his hands gripping the armrests tightly, like a drowning man clutching a piece of driftwood. Graves let her gaze sweep across the room. Lady Evangeline, typically as composed as ice, was now twisting a silk handkerchief between her fingers. Philip Holloway, Sir Reginald's most trusted confidant, stood stiffly in the corner, looking as though a confession was caught in his throat. Richard Vale, the estate's caretaker, was visibly pale, as if he had seen a ghost. And then there was her, Madeline Fairfax, Sir Reginald's own daughter, whose cold stare held an eerie sense of calm, as if she had known all along how this night would end. At last, Inspector Graves spoke, her voice firm and deliberate. "Sir Reginald, you believed this game of deception would last forever. You controlled every corner of this estate with calculated precision, weaving lies like a master puppeteer. But every story has an ending, and yours is tonight. Sir Reginald's fingers clenched around the chair's armrests. Before you accuse me, Inspector, tell me, what evidence do you have? Graves allowed herself a faint smile, as if the question was expected. Evidence? She echoed, a touch of amusement in her tone. The evidence lies in the very trails you left behind. The chest you thought we'd never find, the hidden documents buried deep within, papers detailing the sacrifices your family made to maintain their power, the whispered confessions from those who once swore loyalty to you, the footprints in the old basement where you tried to erase the past. And most importantly, she paused, glancing at Madeline, who remained eerily still, the testimony of your own blood. The room tensed. Sir Reginald's face lost what little color it had left. Lies, he hissed, though his voice wavered. Who among my own kin would stand against me? Inspector Graves turned her gaze toward Madeline. A chilling laugh echoed through the room, as Madeline stepped forward, the soft folds of her white gown swaying as she moved. Her expression was devoid of sorrow, of sympathy. There was only certainty. She looked down at her father, her voice unwavering. You always believed the world revolved around you, father, but you never considered that one day, your own child would turn against you. I heard everything, the whispered conversations you thought were locked behind walls, the sacrifices you made to keep your power intact. How many lives have you erased to protect your throne? How many people have been deceived, silenced, buried beneath the weight of your secrets? Sir Reginald's fingers trembled. Graves raised a hand, and a constable stepped forward. It's over, Sir Reginald, she said. This is no mere accusation. We have evidence, we have witnesses, and now all that remains is justice. The cold steel of the handcuffs clinked around Sir Reginald's wrists. A shift passed through the room, an unspoken relief mixed with exhaustion. The truth had surfaced, and with it, the web of deception had been torn apart, thread by thread. Inspector Graves cast one final glance at Madeline, whose eyes for the first time held something new, not sorrow, nor vengeance, but a quiet liberation. A chilling breeze whispered through the dimly lit chamber as Detective Evelyn Mercer surveyed the aftermath of the night's unraveling truths. The Grand Manor, once a monument to prestige and deception, now lay stripped of its illusions. Shadows flickered against the candle-lit walls, their trembling forms dancing to the silent tune of the past. The air was thick with the scent of rain-drenched earth, and the lingering traces of candle smoke. It was the scent of endings, the echoes of betrayal, whispered behind velvet curtains, and written in hurried strokes across forbidden ledgers, had finally found their way to the light. Evelyn's voice broke the silence, wavering slightly as she turned from the rain-splattered window. Is it really over? Her words carried the weight of long hours spent chasing phantoms, of sleepless nights unraveling a mystery, woven from deceit and desperation. Across the room, Celeste Harrow, a woman whose poise had once been mistaken for indifference, exhaled softly. The flickering glow of the dying fireplace cast shadows over her solemn expression. Yes, she murmured, her voice edged with exhaustion. The truth has come to light, and justice will take its course. The room seemed to exhale with them, a collective release from the suffocating grip of deception. But even as relief settled, an unshakable heaviness remained. A life had been taken, and no amount of justice could restore what had been lost. Evelyn had seen this before, the quiet devastation that followed even the most righteous conclusions. Closure was a myth, the past never stayed buried. Her mind drifted to the pieces she had gathered over the past days. The ledger, hidden beneath the false bottom of a desk drawer, its pages thick with coded transactions that led to a trail of blackmail and blood. The charred remnants of a letter burned hastily in the fireplace, its remaining words hinting at a secret too damning to be spoken aloud. The footprints in the garden, too heavy to belong to the accused, too well placed to be mere coincidence. Each thread had unraveled the tapestry of deception, had drawn her step by step toward the inevitable truth. Justice is a patient hunter, she thought, her voice barely above a whisper. It watches, waits, and when the time is right, it strikes. Beyond the heavy doors, the constables moved in a silent procession through the mist-cloaked courtyard, their captive barely resisting as iron cuffs clinked against the weight of his sins. Sir Reginald Whitmore, the once revered nobleman whose silver tongue had charmed his way into the town's highest circles, stood uncharacteristically silent as he was led away. His tailored coat, always immaculate, was now speckled with the remnants of his own downfall, ash from burned evidence, the dampness of the night's confession. He did not beg, did not protest. He knew the game was over. The guests of the manor, now stripped of pretense, began to disperse. Lady Moreau, once draped in an air of superiority, now clutched the sleeve of her husband, her porcelain composure cracked. The enigmatic Mr. Blackthorne lingered at the threshold, his expression inscrutable, though the tightening of his jaw betrayed the smallest flicker of unease. Servants, who had once moved like ghosts through the estate, now stood in silent clusters, watching as their master was taken away. Evelyn remained by the window until the last of them had vanished beyond the rain-soaked gardens. The mansion, once alive with murmured secrets and concealed betrayals, now stood still, emptied of its conspirators. This silence was different, not the tense, expectant quiet of hidden lies, but the calm that followed a storm. She inhaled deeply, the scent of aged wood and extinguished lanterns grounding her. The town would remember this night. The genteel facade of its elite had been shattered, its people forced to acknowledge that even the most polished halls could conceal darkness. But in that reckoning, there was power. Truth, no matter how devastating, had the ability to cleanse, to rebuild. She turned from the window, smoothing the creases of her coat. No grand declarations were needed, no fanfare or victory speeches. There was only the silent satisfaction of restoring balance, the understanding that for a fleeting moment, the world had been set right. Beyond the manor's iron gates, dawn's first light crept over the landscape, bathing the cobblestone streets in a muted glow. The town, scarred but standing, would endure. The echoes of this case would linger, etched into its history, whispered in its alleyways. But Evelyn knew the truth. The weight of the past could not hold forever. Secrets, no matter how deeply buried, would always find their way to the surface, and when they did, she would be there to uncover them. A stillness settled over Ravenswood Hollow as the weight of the past days lifted, but the scars it left behind would linger like whispers in the dark. At the edge of the village, Eleanor Graves stood beneath the curling ironwork of the old bridge, watching as the last remnants of the night's storm trickled down into the river. Her hands, clasped loosely before her, were steady now, though the tremor of reflection had not yet left her eyes. The village, shrouded in mist, and the aftermath of revelation, had begun its slow return to the rhythm of ordinary life. Yet a change had settled into its bones, a subtle irreversible shift, as though the very air carried the memory of the shadows that had lurked behind its genteel facades. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of a carriage's wheels echoed down the empty lanes, fading into the hush of dawn. The truth had been unearthed, its raw edges exposed beneath the glow of lantern light and whispered confessions. The quiet betrayals that had festered behind lace-curtained windows, the sins buried beneath polished civility, none of it had been enough to escape the reach of justice. And yet, justice, Eleanor knew, was never as simple as the ink on a constable's report. There were wounds that no verdict could mend, absences that no resolution could restore. She thought of Tobias Halloran, his name once uttered with reverence, now spoken only in hushed tones, as though to invoke his memory was to summon the spectre of his fate. His downfall had not been written in bold strokes of villainy, but in the slow unraveling of desperate choices, in the bitter knowledge that even the purest intentions could be twisted into something monstrous. And then there was Vincent Drake, the man who had stood at the center of it all, his charm a thin veil over the rot beneath. She had watched as he was led away in irons, his mask finally shattered, his carefully spun illusions reduced to nothing more than dust in the morning light. He had not spoken a word in his defense, for what use were words when the truth had already damned him? Yet, for all his cunning, he had underestimated one simple thing: secrets were never buried forever. The river had returned what was meant to be forgotten, and the past, patient and unrelenting, had come knocking at last. Eleanor exhaled, a breath that carried with it the weight of days spent untangling the web of deception. She had seen it all, the gloved hands that had rifled through locked drawers, the letters inked with desperation and regret, the glint of candlelight on a hidden blade. The pieces had been there all along, scattered like shards of broken glass, waiting for the right eyes to see. And now, the tale had reached its end, the final chapter written in the echoes of footsteps, fading down cobbled streets. Ravenswood Hollow would move forward, as all places did. The baker would knead his dough, the tailor would stitch her hems, and the world would pretend, for a time, that nothing had changed. But Eleanor knew better. The village had learned in the cruelest of ways that darkness didn't always creep in from the outside. It could be born from within, nurtured by silence, fed by fear. And though the storm had passed, the echoes of its fury would remain, woven into the fabric of the place, waiting for the next whisper of unease, the next flicker of a shadow where none should be. The wind stirred the leaves above her, rustling like voices lost to time. She turned away from the river, stepping onto the path that led back toward the village, toward the warmth of candlelight and the promise of something like peace. But even as she walked, she knew that there would always be another mystery waiting just beyond the veil, another truth lurking in the quiet spaces of the world, waiting for someone willing to see.